for having me. Being the only woman in this program, at least I'm sure I will be the best presentation by a woman today. Actually, the paper I'm going to present is a joint work with Julian Di Giovanni and Andrei Levchenko. And the paper is about basically international business cycle co-movements. And actually, when I committed on presenting this paper, I thought that I would be able to present new findings on this topic. And I've been less productive than expected, so these are going to be like results we already had a couple of months ago, but hopefully still interesting. So the basic topic that we want to discuss in this paper is related to this famous trade co-movement correlation that we see in the data, which is often referred to as the Frankel and Rose stylized fact, that shows that countries that trade more together tend to have business cycles that are more strongly correlated. And this is something that has been shown in many different data sets and over time since the first 1998 paper on this. And there is also some evidence in the literature that this is true as well for countries that are more strongly linked through multinational linkages. And Farid, I don't know where he is, but he has a very nice paper on this. So this is a well-established stylized fact. But there are still some unresolved questions regarding this stylized fact. The most important one being related to the underlying mechanism. So basically, the most natural way I think you can interpret this trade co-movement correlation is as trade linkages inducing some real channels through which shocks can transmit from one country to another, and this is what would cause the positive co-movement in business cycles. So this is what how people have usually interpreted this correlation, but there is yet another interpretation which has been pointed out by Jean Ims, which is that countries that trade more together might also be more exposed to common shocks, and this might be at the root of the co-movement. So in this paper, we're going to try build an empirical strategy that helps distinguish between those two explanations of the correlation. And then even if you take it as granted that this correlation is to some extent revealing that shocks are transmitted across countries through international trade, the microeconomic underpinnings, I think, are still quite unclear. And in particular, there is this nice paper by Robert Johnson that points out to this trade co-movement puzzle, by which he means that even if you take quite sophisticated international business cycle model, you have really a hard time reproducing this correlation with a model, especially with existing models that usually reproduce business cycle co-movements using aggregate shocks. So it seems that all those models, even when quite sophisticated with a lot of input-output linkages between countries, cannot really reproduce this very high correlation between trade and co-movements. So the way we're going to try revisit this literature is by looking more specifically at the role of individual firms as a driver of this transmission of shocks across countries. And by doing this, we're going to take inspiration from the literature in macroeconomics about granular fluctuation, to which Daron has contributed. So in this literature, there are basically two seminal papers. The first one is the Gabet paper that shows that when the distribution of firm size in the economy is sufficiently fat-tailed, idiosyncratic shocks to individual firms might not average out in the aggregate, and in particular, shocks hitting the largest firms in the economy are going to generate a substantial amount of aggregate fluctuations. And the point for the argument for granular fluctuation has been further reinforced in Daron's paper, that shows that whenever there are linkages between firms or sectors, for instance, input-output linkages, shocks to individual firms or sectors are likely to propagate along those input-output networks, and this means that their final impact at the aggregate is going to be amplified. Okay, and in that case, what matters the most for generating granular fluctuation is the asymmetry in the form of the networks, and the most important units in that case are not necessarily the biggest firms, but those that are the most connected in those input-output linkages. And with Julian and André, we have a paper in which we show that, at least in the case of France, microeconomic shocks to individual firms are indeed a key driver of aggregate fluctuations. So what we want to do in this paper is basically to keep this idea that individual firms might be important in the aggregate, but show how they matter for international co-movements. And by doing this, we are also taking inspiration from the trade literature that has shown firms in international markets are very granular in a way, because if you take the distribution of firms in the economy, only the biggest firms really participate to international markets, and thus those big firms that are very more likely to trade and have multinational linkages might be quite important in generating international co-movements. So we are going to try to say something about the role of individual firms as a driver of those international co-movements. We're also going to try to see what type of linkages are the most important. Is it mostly like trade linkages or multinational linkages? And then in the longer run, and this is really what we are working on right now, we want to say something about the type of shocks that are transmitted and how they are transmitted across countries. But again, we haven't done enough yet so that I can really talk about that. Okay, so what this paper is doing more specifically is to provide a firm-level view of international business cycle co-movements that is going to exploit a rich data set, a census of French firms that we observe over time, and for which we have very detailed information about the evolution of their value added and sales, and most importantly, their activity in international markets. So in particular, we know for all of those firms whether they import from a particular source country, whether they export to a particular source country, and whether they have multinational linkages with other countries, by which I mean whether the firm is an affiliate of a foreign firm or whether it has affiliate in a foreign country. So those different links between firms and foreign countries are going to help us define some direct connection between firms and countries at the bilateral level. And the first thing that we are going to do is to document what is the importance of those directly connected firms for the aggregate activity. And without much surprise, we are going to show that they are quite important in the aggregate. Then we are going to estimate what is the impact of having a direct connection with a given country on the firm-level correlation with that country. So basically, we ask whether a firm which exports, say, to Germany is on average more correlated with the German business cycle than a firm that does not. And then, having established this at the firm level, we are going to aggregate up to measure, to quantify the contribution of firms and those firms' direct linkages with foreign country for business cycle co-movement. Importantly, but probably not enough, we are also going to try measure the impact of indirect linkages within the economy, by which I mean that I might not directly export to the German market, but might be in contact with a firm that itself exports to the German market, and this eventually could tend to synchronize my own activity with that specific country. So from that point of view, a direct link with the German economy might not be the only source of co-movement between firms and the German economy, but indirect linkages might be important as well. Yes?
Perhaps we don't have this level of granularity in the data, but one interesting thing is that the implications of quote-unquote supply and demand shocks should be very different, right?
The implication of what, sorry?
Supply and demand shocks.
Yeah.
So in other words, so if the German firms become more productive, that should lead to a boost of the firms that industries or sectors that buy from those, but should depress those that sell in a competing way in all of their suppliers. On the other hand, if there's a German demand shock, which also increases the production of those firms, that should, on the other hand, have no effect on the downstream guys, but it should lead to an expansion of all of the upstream. So I wonder whether that sort of identification frame or something like that could be, I mean, it's perhaps much beyond this.
Yeah, so I think that to really do this, we need to be more structured than what we are in this paper. So I'm not going to answer this question, but this is really where we want to go. So there are two ways we are going to try and answer this question. One is to be very structural, so build a multi-country, multi-sector model in which individual French firms have linkages with other firms, and then in this model we can have supply and demand shocks and see how and if they propagate across countries. This is the first answer. The second one that is probably more ambitious that we have in mind is that we're trying to work with firm-to-firm trade data, the same ones as those that Francis talked about this morning. But what we have is, so we observe all the individual customers that French firms have abroad, but we also have some information on those customers, and we try to match this with shocks affecting those firms. Okay, so for instance, we know whether the Spanish firm has faced a financial shock because its bank has had some issues, and using this information, we are going to see how this type of structural shocks spread out to the French economy. But again, I think this needs to be more structural than what we are in this paper. Just a summary of results in case I don't have time to finish. So the directly connected firms that we identify, so again, those firms that either trade or have multinational activity with other countries, they represent a very small share of the population of French firms, about like 8 to 10% in our data. But because they are an order of magnitude larger than the mean firm, they represent a substantial share of the aggregate value added. And also we find in our regression setup that they are significantly more correlated with those countries they have direct links with. And this is true even once we control for common shocks. Okay, so there seems to be a sort of transmission of shocks that induces those individual firms to co-move more with that country. And then when we aggregate, we find that those firms account for about like 70% of the aggregate correlation between France and its main partners. At the end of the talk, I might be able to say something more about just the top 100 firms in France and how much they represent, and their share in the aggregate correlation between France and its main partners is quite substantial. And then we also do some sort of counterfactual in which we ask what would happen if all those firms were unable to continue trade with foreign countries, or just if all those links were severed. And in that case, the correlation between France and those countries would fall by about 0.1, which is about 1/3 of the aggregate correlation between France and those countries. And we also show that the impact is further amplified if we also take into account indirect linkages. So again, the fact that when I trade with a firm which itself is exposed to foreign shocks, I also tend to correlate more with the country the firm is exposed to. Okay, so I'm going to be quick on the related literature. I briefly talked about the literature on international real business cycles and also the literature on the granularity. The only type of papers I haven't mentioned are those that are doing more or less what we're doing. So our competitors, I would say, in this literature. So Farid, again, has a paper on this, and André is diversifying risk, so he has several papers on the same topic.
called cheating.
Optimizing. Okay, just to say a word on the conceptual framework that we have in mind, which is quite simple. So basically what we do in this paper, and this was true as well in the previous paper that we have together, is to start from the micro level and aggregate up to the country level. So here the object of interest is this correlation coefficient in growth rate between a country, which is going to be France, and its partners. Here it's going to be the 10 most important partners of France, so the little c here. So by definition, this is the this correlation is just the covariance in growth rate divided by standard deviation. So what is important is that this aggregate growth in France is just an aggregate of what takes place at the firm level. So if you just restrict yourself at the intensive margin, which is what we do in most of the paper, you can simply rewrite this aggregate growth rate as a weighted average of what takes place in each firm in France. Okay, so gamma ft here would be the growth rate in value added of firm f between t minus 1 and t. And when you aggregate this, taking into account the fact that firms are heterogeneous in size, you obtain a measure of the aggregate growth rate. So by combining these two equations, you really get the sense of the exercise that we do. We are going to study those correlation coefficients and then aggregate them accordingly to go back to the object of interest at the macro level, which is this international co-movement. Yes?
I think it's very naive comment, but you compute the correlation and then you do the summation.
Yeah, so there is a typo here. It's conditional on the weight for a given period. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah.
Can you look at the aggregate in terms of distribution and look the correlation between distribution? You have distribution.
Yeah.
So you can like compute a copula between this distribution other than to play at the
Maybe we
level. Or a specific, well, the first equation you wrote. So you do these two mathematical objects and you see how they are related and you compute some.
I'm not sure. I think what we do is really way simpler than this. We work with this object at the firm level, so we have a distribution of these correlations, and then we just aggregate them accordingly to go back to the object of interest, which is this one, but I'm not sure this is what you're asking. Anyway, we can discuss afterward.
I think he's saying that they could be non-independent among them when you go back to the first equation.
Okay, anyway, we can discuss perhaps at the end. Okay, so at the micro level, again, we start from the micro level. We have this estimation equation, which is basically the Frankel and Ross type of regression, but except that as left-hand side variable, we no longer have the correlation in business cycles between France and the foreign country, but between this particular firm and the foreign country. Okay, and this additional dimension with respect to the literature is going to be very helpful because it is what is going to help us control for common shocks.
Just a stupid comment. You have the economy is a set of firms, but then you could have the spillovers across firms somehow. So in the previous thing, in a sense, if the spillovers themselves are affected.
Yeah, so I'm going to.
Isn't that something that you are somehow putting under the carpet?
Yes, I'm going to discuss these spillovers in a specific way in the next slide. Perhaps it's going to.
The W, so that we have not the W by the weights. You see what I mean? The previous.
No, the spillovers. I'm not sure in that case. In the W.
Just be the. We would say it could be that the various firms are affected. They have a correlation with the country, but then they have the spillovers among themselves that are affected somehow. And
yeah, so in that case, part of this effect is going to be captured by, indeed, in this fixed effect, there will be more than just common macro shock if you want. There might be other spillover ending up here. So this is why what we care really about is having this beta being estimated, controlling for a set of things that we do not observe, which are absorbed into those fixed effects, I would say. So again, this is the regression that we are using, and we are going to see how this firm level correlation between the firm and a particular country is affected by this firm having some direct link with this country in the form of exporting to C, importing from C, being an affiliate of a firm located in C, or being a firm with affiliate in country C. And again, what the firm level dimension is going to buy us is the possibility to control in this equation for country fixed effect. And these are the country fixed effects that are going to absorb everything which is related to common shock. So if it was the case that the Frankel and Roth correlation was only driven by common shocks, then the impact of those common shocks, would be absorbed into those delta C, and the impact of having some direct linkages with the foreign country would be insignificant. So this is really how we want to solve the first question that I discussed about. So this is a way to refine the interpretation of the macro results by using the extra firm dimension and separating what is related to common shocks versus the transmission of shocks through those linkages. And then we are also going to control for some form of spillovers, but a very particular one. So again, what we have in mind is that I might not be directly linked with a foreign country, but through my relationship with other firms in the economy, I might be indirectly, and this is something that can be interesting important for spreading shocks across countries. So ideally, if you want to...
You have similarities also with other countries. I mean, they have the same input-output structure.
Yeah, so this would be absorbed into the delta C.
This paper by Shankerman, Bloom, and Van Reenen, where they look, they have the proximity in the demand dimension or in the technology dimension.
Yeah, so this would be captured into the fixed effect. Okay, if, say, the structure of production in France is closer to, say, Germany than to China, then the co-movement that is induced by this similarity is going to be absorbed into the fixed effect. Okay, but this sort of transmission of shocks through indirect linkages is something that we want to approximate.
I mean, I don't know how important this is, but I think Philippe's comment won't be taken up by a fixed effect, because I think his comment is essentially like the more micro version of the Jean Imps story, that your input-output is similar to mine.
Yeah, but...
So therefore, when some place in my input-output network is hit, it is hit in your input-output network with a similar shock. The fixed effects won't take that because fixed effects is the average across all firms. So this is more localized than...
Yeah, so this is why those fixed effects are going to be first defined at the country level and then at the sector times country level. So if there is a sectoral shock and the two countries have a strong exposure to those shocks, this would be absorbed. And we'll also have a version in which this fixed effect will be specific to the commuting zone. So controlling for all shocks affecting a given commuting zone. Say that if you're a firm in Alsace, a shock affecting all firms in Alsace might be important and correlated with shock affecting Germany. So this indirect exposure to shocks we have in mind is driven by, again, firm-to-firm input-output relationship within France. So ideally, we would like to know whether a firm F has an input link with a firm G, which this firm being itself exposed to country C because, say, it imports from country C. The problem is that those input-output coefficients at the firm-to-firm level are not available in France. So the way we proceed is by using information on the input-output, sectoral input-output tables, and then the propensity of firms in different sectors to either import from or export to a given country. Okay, and in this variable, so we are going to construct them mostly using information at the sectoral level, and we are going to put some firm dimensionality by taking into account the fact that firms might be different in terms of their reliance on inputs. Okay, so the intensity of input usage at the firm level, and also firms might be different in terms of how much they sell to the domestic market. Okay, so this will be our two very imperfect measure of indirect linkages with the foreign country. So this is what we do at the micro level, and again, then we want to say something about aggregate co-movement. So we are going to aggregate up to the country level, and here we are going to do two sorts of exercise. The first one is just a pure accounting exercise in which we are going to compute the contribution of this subsample of firms to the overall co-movement. This subsample being defined as all the firms that have a direct connection with that particular country. So how much do they contribute to the co-movement between France and this country? And then we are going to do a very naive counterfactual exercise in which, using micro-level estimation results, we are going to be able to predict what would happen if those firms were no longer linked with the foreign country. So this is just aggregating what we estimate at the firm level, and then aggregating, we can say something about what would happen to the aggregate co-movement between France and, say, Germany if all firms were at some point unable to trade with say, Germany. Okay, so of course this is a kind of naive exercise because this takes as given that the fixed effect would be unchanged. So in some way there is no general equilibrium effect of France being unable to trade with Germany, but this is also a way to say something about the quantitative impact of this transmission of shocks through firm linkages with the foreign country. So in terms of the data, we are using as usual, all the data available in France. So these are mostly the fiscal tax forms that give information at the firm level about value added and sales, merged with the customs data that give information on trade at the firm to country level, and the liaison financière data set that has information on multinational ownerships. Okay, and at that point, I think I need to say that the liaison financière data set is less precise, is of less quality than the customs data, which are exhaustive. So part of the results that we have that are not always significant for multinational ownership might be related to the fact that the quality of the data is not as high as we would like. Okay, we are going to study the co-movement of France with 10 countries. So initially we took the 10 most important partners of France, and then we ended up with a sample that was very much based on countries from the European Union. So then we replaced some countries so that we have more diversity in the set of countries that we are studying. Okay, we could add more countries. The issue here is not really in terms of the dimensionality, but whenever we add more countries, we're going to add a lot of zeros in our regression, so the identification power is not that good. So at some point you get some trade-off between having more information and losing identification power.
How the different sector firms are financially constrained or not? It was French firms?
Yeah, so yeah, we do not.
Such data, we know
there is some in the balance sheet data, I guess we could.
Incident payment and things like that.
So incident payment is not easy to obtain. Incident payment is really a data set that is restricted to people at Banque de France, so it's not easy to use it. But in the tax forms.
You wouldn't have it. It's totally restricted.
No, because it would be fun to find out if firms that are less constrained maybe are less vulnerable to shocks elsewhere or whatever.
So what we intend to do,
a bit like going the Manova way. If you could see that at the micro level, that would be better for subsequent papers.
So in the subsequent paper, what we have in mind, so we have information about Spanish firms having some issues with their banks, because this is less restricted, it seems, in Spain than in France. And we can match this with firms trading with France and see how these financial shocks spread to the French economies through international trade. So this is something that we have in mind, but looking at the foreign firms instead of the French ones. So this is just to say, how much time do I have?
Exactly
5? Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is just to say that our data...
There is a joke there that Darren knows. There was a seminar at MIT, and the speaker, and he was interrupted all the time by Andre Schleifer. You remember? And Bank Holmstrom said, you know, Andre, you have only 10 more minutes. You remember? That was a good joke. I zip it from.
Does this count as my in my 5 minutes? Or? Okay, so this is just to compare our data with like official IMF data to show that we have co-movements that are in line with what you would expect. So most of our countries in the sample are European ones, but we have China, which co-moves negatively with France. Okay, I'm going to go a bit faster. So this is just some sort of summary statistics to show how the firms in our sample, the extent to which they have this sort of direct connections with different countries we're studying. So these are the different countries. You see that in our data we have something like almost 1 million French firms, and in this sample of firms there are very few of them that have a direct connection with one of those countries. So the total is like 8% of firms have a direct connection with one of those countries. But because they are big, their combined share as a share of the aggregate GDP is about 56%. So like 8% of firms, but they are way larger than the average. And then mostly those firms have connections through trade. Okay, this is the most usual way firms participate to international markets, while having some connections through multinational is something that is not very, that is quite rare. So this is the most important table that we have in the paper, in which we have those micro-regressions. So remember that the left-hand side variable is the correlation between a single firm and a single country. We have about 8 million points in our data set. So these are 800,000 firms times 10 partners. This gives us our sample. So this is the simple regression without any fixed effect. So the simple correlation, and we see, as expected, all coefficients being positive and significant. So firms that import, export, have a multinational link with a given country, co-move significantly more with that foreign country. This continues to be true when we control for fixed effect, firm fixed effect, sorry. So we have about 800,000 fixed effect, and it doesn't change anything. What is really remarkable in this table is how the result change when we control for the country fixed effect. So this is really something that is striking, because here we had only 10 dummies in this regression framework, but the coefficients are very strongly affected, and they are way lower than in the unconstrained regression. So this means that the common shocks that are absorbed into those country fixed effects are quite important in driving the correlation, the trade co-movement correlation. But still, the coefficients are found significant most of the time, at least when it comes to connections through international trade, and this is less true for multinational linkages. And so these coefficients continue to be positive and significant. So importing from a foreign country induces a stronger correlation between that firm and that foreign country, in comparison with this same firm correlation with another country from which it does not import. Okay, and this continues to be true when we control for more fixed effects, or taking into account the precise zone d'emploi of the firm or its sector of activity.
You have firm fixed effect,
Yeah, everywhere we have firm fixed effect, and between 2 and 3 we add the 10 country fixed effect, and this is really where the results are affected. Okay, when we control for being an importer indirectly or indirectly exporting to the foreign country, we also have interesting and expected results. So in that case, as I said, those variables are constructed using sectoral input-output coefficients. So as you can see here, it's quite important in this particular regression to control for fixed effect that have the sector dimension. But once we have those country times sector fixed effect, we find that the two coefficients are positive and significant, again meaning that I am more correlated with the country that is connected to my customers, basically. Okay, so now I've got this new and nice micro-level result. What do they imply at the aggregate level? So the first thing I'm doing here is just to...
One question? This is very fascinating, your previous table. I wonder whether, I'm super surprised that importer and exporter effects are so similar at some level, but I wonder whether you could distinguish the importer effect and correlation between downstream and exporter with upstream. So right now, you're imposing the same importer and exporter effects with all firms between two countries. But simple sort of input-output would suggest that importers from Germany should be correlated with a different set of firms than exporters. And you could allow for that, and that would add like a very interesting level of finesse to this.
I see that this would be interesting, but I'm not sure how I could do this.
So you look at the table from one country, and you classify all firms as downstream or upstream to me, or perhaps unrelated, and then you allow the importer dummy to be interacted by unrelated upstream, downstream, exporter dummy unrelated.
But you mean the firms that are located abroad?
Which are downstream to me according to the input-output table.
Okay, but in this paper, the next one, hopefully we will have firm-to-firm trade data. But here
some of the effects may not be going bilaterally, it might be going through market prices, so this would capture both.
One way of doing this would be to use the product that is imported.
Yeah, we could have, I mean, I think what you're saying is that this growth rate at the country level might be true aggregated, and we could take, like, say, the growth rate with one particular sector, or eventually at the product level. This indeed we could do. Okay, then we aggregate. So the first thing, so remember, we have this split of the population of French firms into those that are directly connected and those that are not. The directly connected, there are 8% of them. They represent 56% of aggregate value added, and because they are more correlated than the average with the country they have connection with, they represent an even larger share of the aggregate co-movement. So this is what we have here. If you compare those two numbers, this sample, this very small sample of firms is responsible for about 70% of the aggregate co-movement, and this is even more true when we look at only manufacturing firms. And then this is the last result, the last table that I wanted to show. This is the results of the counterfactual I discussed before. So what would be the impact in terms of the aggregate co-movement between France and Germany if all links were severed between these two countries? So the answer is here. So the impact would be a decrease in the mean correlation coefficient of about 0.1, which is to be compared with this 0.3 average correlation in our data. And as you can see from this decomposition here, most of the effect comes from severing trade linkages, because in our data, these trade linkages are more important as a driver of the correlation between the firm and the foreign country, and also, and most of all, because there are many more firms that do trade with foreign countries than firms in this subsample. So most of the effect is driven by the trade linkages in our data. And the final column here is yet another counterfactual in which we simulate what would happen if the distribution of firm size in the economy was uniform. Okay? As I said before, the reason why this effect is very important is because those firms that have direct linkages with foreign countries, they are larger than the average. So the distribution of firm size matters a lot in driving this result. Instead, if all firms were uniform in size, but still heterogeneous in terms of their participation to international trade, the impact of removing those linkages would be way smaller. Okay, so I'm going to skip this table. The impact is even stronger if I take into account indirect linkages, and this is quite normal, I guess. And then I just wanted to just zoom in rapidly on the very top of the distribution. So a lot of what we say is just that big firms tend to over-participate to international markets, and this is why they are very important in explaining the transmission of shocks across countries. And this is true even at the very top of the distribution if I look at the top 100 firms in our data. So there are very few of them, just 100, but they are big. So they represent about 20% of the aggregate value added in France. And of course, most of them have some direct connection with foreign countries. They tend to trade more and be more strongly, participate more to multinational firms. And what is interesting is that not only do these firms participate to international markets, but they also tend to participate to international markets in a multidimensional way. So most of them would have connection with all the countries that we have in our sample, and probably way more. So this means that whenever, if it is true that these firms participate to transmitting shocks across countries, they do transmit those shocks in various places around the world. And this is why it's quite interesting to look at these very few firms and how they help transmit shocks across countries. So this is really what we want to go to. So again, what we showed in this paper and what we continue working on is that large firms tend to over-participate to international markets. So whenever they import and export, they are going to help transmit shocks across countries. And as you said before, there are different types of shocks they can transmit, both supply and demand shocks. Perhaps more surprisingly, what we show, notably in the paper with Francis that we have together, is that those large firms, even if they are big, you would expect that they are very well diversified in terms of their activity abroad. They are not. Very often they trade with a limited number of countries and a limited number of firms in those countries, so they are left quite exposed to idiosyncratic shocks. So this might be important in understanding the transmission of those idiosyncratic shocks. They are also quite heterogeneous in terms of the composition of their import and export basket, and Claire has a very interesting paper showing this on the import side. So this means that there is a large amount of randomness in the data in terms of what type of shocks firms are exposed to, and they are also very likely to be central players in input-output networks. So it's really worth studying these particular firms and how they help transmit shocks across countries. So this is it.